Back in 2012, when Lucasfilm was acquired by Disney, you can imagine Melinda and I were having a lot of conversations. More like I was subjecting Melinda to a lot of conversations about the acquisition. And the first thing I said at the time was, now that Disney has bought Lucasfilm, they would be stupid not to kick all of this off with an X-Wing pilot show. And of course, they didn't do that because they were stupid. But fortunately, the fans are doing the best work. If you've been following RetroBlasting for a few years, you know that we don't talk about fan films, and there's no bylaw or requirement that we don't. It's really because fan films are an exercise in passion and sacrifice, just for the love of a franchise, and only to get the adoration and mutual respect back of people who are fans of the same thing you are so they can enjoy a new story. You're purely doing it for your love and their enjoyment. That is a completely selfless act. And I don't want to be the person that comes in and starts critiquing one that might objectively have problems. I don't see any reason to do that. I feel like it's picking on somebody who's not doing anything wrong, who's over on the side of the room just entertaining themselves, and you decide rather than critique the way the teacher is doing things, aka the IP holder, you turn around and you decide to start picking on somebody at the desk over here. I don't want to do that. I'm not going to be that guy. Because invariably, if I started focusing on fan films, you're going to run into some that have real problems. You're going to run into fan films that don't have good acting or don't have good production value. And there's a lot of those. It doesn't mean that I don't respect the effort. Like I said, I think it's a wonderful thing to do. Full stop, which is why I won't touch them. I won't touch them because the intent behind them is pure. The intent behind them is pure passion and enthusiasm for what they love. And I don't want to be a person that then comes in and tromps on it. I started watching fan films somewhat regularly back in the late 90s when the internet was finally coming into its own with a little bit of video hosting. And so I got to see Troops.
I'm talking. I listen to you, now you listen to me. That's how this works, okay?
One of the most famous Star Wars fan films of all time. A mastery of satire and production immersion, perfectly executed for its day. Impressive, production value for its day. But then after that, people started chasing it. And they weren't doing it all that well. And there were a lot of fan films back around that prequel era of Star Wars that were just people in the woods in sort of Jedi costumes doing lightsaber battles with sort of pithy dialogue and just showing off that they could do a lightsaber effect for 10 minutes or whatever it was. And again, I will always respect the passion that someone has to go out and do something like that because they love the property that much. But it doesn't mean that I found any enjoyment in the piece itself. And so as those became more and more commonplace, I started to drift away from watching fan movies altogether. I watched a few episodes of Star Trek Continues and Star Trek The New Voyages. Very, very high production value. You can't say for a moment that they're not professionally done and post-produced. But again, I had formed this distance with that because the Star Trek world was, by and large, trying to recreate cast members and characters that had already been adequately chronicled. And that put me at a distance a little bit, not because I don't believe in good recastings, but because I felt like you were taking the worthy exercise of fan filmmaking and then applying it to an unnecessary challenge when you could be telling the story of a new crew somewhere doing something different. Again, taking nothing away from those shows. They're very, very well made, and they've earned their fan bases for a reason, which is why I don't want to get into analyzing that kind of stuff. Star Wars, on the other hand, was its own beast. And aside from the aforementioned lightsaber battle films that were all over the place for a while as they tried to claw in more and more production value and special effects technology for the home became more and more available, coincidentally and ironically thanks to George Lucas, people started to get more ambitious, and the next thing you knew, they were trying to branch out and do different things. And that's great. That's amazing. But it still wasn't grabbing me because Star Wars is a very different animal from Star Trek. Star Trek, even at its A level with the real shows, they have the famous bottle episodes where they don't leave the ship. And the reason they don't leave the ship for those episodes is they build in a number of those throughout each season to save money so that they can have episodes that have more sets and more locations. Star Wars doesn't have that advantage. Star Wars is epic battles between either scores of Jedi and then scores of battle droids, or it's, in my era, massive fleets of spaceships colliding with one another and dog fights and all kinds of amazing stuff happening. Huge locations that are very stark, whether it's, a snow tundra or a desert or an entire, redwood forest. And then you build in all the special effects and all the walkers and all the stuff. Star Wars is a tall order for filmmaking, let alone fan filmmaking. So why am I even talking about Wingman today then? Well, the X-Wing pilots are, to me, the core of Star Wars outside of the conflict between Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. Because Star Wars isn't a boy versus an evil despot. Star Wars implies a galactic scale war. It's a civil war. It says it in the first line of the crawl of the first movie. It is a period of civil war. And that forms the bedrock of the entire Star Wars mythology. So for me as a kid watching it, yes, I loved Luke Skywalker. Yes, I loved the fact that he had a lightsaber and he had the Force. But as a child, I was never unaware. I was very actively aware that Luke wasn't just a Jedi in training. Luke was also a uniformed member of an alliance, a rebellion, a resistance to tyranny. And his role in that was as an officer and a combat fighter pilot with a squadron of guys behind him who had no special abilities whatsoever except for amazing piloting skills like Wedge Antilles. These were guys who put everything on the line, and they didn't have any superpowers to fight the Empire. And they were going up against incredible odds, and it was a desperate battle. That fascinated me as a kid. Fascinated me. So when I was thinking about Star Wars, this is my childhood X-Wing right here. And that was the very first vehicle I ever asked for, aside from my action figures. Like, my mom was like, well, what vehicle do you want for Christmas? I said, I want the X-Wing fighter. That's what I want. I want the X-Wing fighter, Mom. The Millennium Falcon came later. Just to give you an idea, the Millennium Falcon was 7 months after that. My priority was that starfighter right there. Because those pilots, including Luke Skywalker, of which he was one of their leaders, they were the front line. That was the front line we got to see in Star Wars in 2 movies. And it was the very first front line we really ever got to see, unless you can count the Rebel fleet troopers that get, shot up in the beginning in the Blockade Runner. But that was like a skirmish that occurred. Whereas the first big hold the line moment for the rebellion was Rebel pilots in X-Wings and Y-Wings versus a crazy amount of TIE fighters and a Death Star. They were going to be the ones that were going to stop this because, yes, you have your ground troops, and we see them in Empire Strikes Back, and it is Very, very effective. But the ground troops were still supported and they were, putting their hopes in the pilots. And that's not untrue to history, especially when you get to, World War II. The ground troops, as much as they resent the pilots at times, they need them and they want them. They would prefer the pilots take care of it so they don't have to put themselves totally at risk. And then in Return of the Jedi, I don't even have to tell you how amazing that was to see those pilots just dive right into, a 10-to-1 scenario with Imperial TIE fighters and trying to make sense out of the chaos. Really, really incredible for a kid to internalize. When we went into the dark times and there was no more Star Wars on screen, it wasn't long before they started prioritizing the starfighter combat as a licensing opportunity. It was built in to a lot of the merch. So by the time we got into the late 80s, early 90s, and Star Wars was coming back in different ways, you had West End Games making sure that they did the special boxed module for the role-playing game called Star Warriors, which is all about trying to take starfighter combat from the role-playing game and give you an alternative, even more detailed way to execute starfighter combat if you got into those situations with your character. And then to go a step further, a year or two after that, it was X-Wing, the PC simulator, where you were in the cockpits of all 4 major rebel fighters flying missions fighting the Empire. And if you didn't play that when you were a teenager or an adolescent, you probably missed out on one of the most immersive Star Wars experiences that was ever created that wasn't a movie. X-Wing was this, I can't even describe the experience now. I can't find my words because the missions were all varied. It wasn't just shoot down a bunch of TIE fighters every mission. There were escort missions. There were rescue missions. There were, reconnaissance missions where you weren't supposed to fire a shot, but you were having to fly right through an entire Imperial fleet. And you were stuck in that cockpit doing it. And it was all in real time. And you had to mitigate your damage and do the shield energy to your engines and engine energy to your weapons because you're out of, blaster shots and cannon shots and all that stuff. Your R2 unit was trying to give you information, and it was for something that was way before VR. X-Wing, with the dynamic music and everything like that in the original versions, of which this collector CD-ROM is one, X-Wing was an unbelievable Star Wars experience. Better than any first-person shooter, as good as some of those were that came after it. X-Wing was where it was at, which is why I'm still shocked to this day that they haven't truly, I know they did Squadrons recently, but that was like a very, very short game, but they haven't truly gone back and dialed in on that. They haven't focused in on that. And the thing is, and I promise I'm going to get to Wingman here in a second, but I gotta set this up properly. The thing is that Disney not doing anything with the X-Wing pilots and then canning Rogue Squadron, which was them finally getting around to do it and then canning it, is the most supremely stupid thing that I've ever seen a company be unable to zero in on. I can't believe that with all of the books and comics that I read about the X-Wing pilots that came out in the 90s and the PC games, the multiple PC games that came out, X-Wing, X-Wing Supplement, TIE Fighter Supplement, then X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, then X-Wing Alliance. I can't believe that they didn't see the potential for an X-Wing based television show. And remember, all those games I just rattled off were before they then came out with the more 3D perspective game, not 3D perspective, but third person perspective, Star Wars Rogue Squadron. And once that moniker stuck, it kind of stuck around. But the X-Wing stuff was popular long before they applied Rogue Squadron to it. See, now they've distilled it all down. And now it's just, well, when I think of X-Wings, I think of stories about Rogue Squadron. And it's like, well, okay, but that isn't even necessary to tell the story of these pilots. Rogue Squadron is just one squadron. It's like Easy Company and Band of Brothers. Yeah, Easy Company's really cool, but there's all these other companies. There's all these other squadrons. Point I'm trying to make is new characters, new scenarios, new interpersonal dynamics, all kinds of situations to dream up, some of which wouldn't even necessarily require being in a starfighter, but the experience of being pilots behind enemy lines. All of this had such potential, and it would have been something that didn't require them as inept writers trying to bust up the original mythology like they did with the sequel trilogy. They wouldn't have had to even touch that mythology. They could have left everything capped off with Return of the Jedi and gone and sharpened their skills playing in this other area where everybody wanted to see it. Everybody wanted to see X-Wing pilots in a show. And there they could have had new characters that were apart from all that maybe were taking place either right after Return of the Jedi to clear up the Imperial Remnant, or between Star Wars and Jedi. They could have, it could have been either. The sky was the limit. In fact, the sky wasn't the limit because they were starfighter pilots. So the parent company misses the boat on this. Meanwhile, the most popular Star Wars fan film since Troops hits, and it is an animated, anime-style, original trilogy setting action sequence that involves rebel pilots dogfighting with TIE fighter pilots. And it's one of the best Star Wars fan films that has ever been made. But once again, the parent company didn't take the hint. And now along comes this 50-minute fan film called Wingman. And I got wind of it last week, and I was like, okay, let me put it on my radar. I'm going to go watch it, because it was the first time. This was the first time in 25 years since Troops that I was like, wait, what? I got to watch that fan film.
3's going down. Now repeat. 3 is down.
I got around to watching other fan films in the past, but it was never a priority. Even most recently, there was a Star Wars fan film that will remain nameless because I don't want to dunk on any particular production, because I do believe that all of these productions are wonderful things to attempt to accomplish. They're done with purity of heart. And I got about 3 minutes into it, and I was like, nope. And I got out of it. Fan films generally, for me, just don't click. But when they said there's this fan film called Wingman, and it's about the X-Wing pilots, and I went and I looked it up, and I was like, oh my God, they're not even trying to recreate characters that are in the movies. In other words, this movie is not trying to trade on known characters. It's not trying to trade on, they don't have an actor in this that's trying to pretend to play Luke Skywalker or anything like that. Because this production, and I say this with all reverence and all sincerity, this production had the intelligence to know we don't need those characters to tell a compelling story. The X-Wing pilots as a concept is what's compelling. The space dogfight experience is what's compelling. This is what's going to carry this story. We don't need Jedi and lightsabers in this. That's not what Star Wars was always about. Star Wars had just a few characters with lightsabers in the Force, and the rest of it was the wars part, which is why I think Rogue One could have been such a much more effective movie if they had stuck with Gareth Edwards' original concept and not gotten scared off by it. But I won't go down that rabbit hole now. I'll save that for another video. And I liked Rogue One, but it's a love-hate relationship. We'll talk about that later. Wingman doesn't trade on even the Rogue Squadron name. Wingman doesn't even trade on the Star Wars name. Wingman is confident enough to say, this is an X-Wing story. And I'm like, oh my God. Like this is exactly what I've been wanting Really, since I was 7.
Hunter 6, standing by.
No, 6. Since I was 6 years old. Definitely what I've wanted since I was 14, 15 years old. And even more what I wanted since 2015 when Force Awakens came out, and I'd been telling Melinda for 3 years, I don't know why they're not working on an X-Wing show right now. And then, of course, they got Patty Jenkins, and then they fired Patty Jenkins because they're Disney Lucasfilm. And I had to laugh because I thought, well, that's too bad. But at the same time, I don't want this Lucasfilm working on an X-Wing show because they won't know what to do with it. I'm not trying to dance around Wingman. I'm trying to be respectful so that people will go watch it because I don't want to give away any story points, okay? But the production value of Wingman is staggeringly good. And I don't even just mean for a fan film like, check your standards at the door. I don't even mean it like that. For a fan film, it's unbelievable what they accomplished with the special effects, because they don't do this sleight of hand thing where it's like, yeah, it's about the X-Wing pilots, but then it's just like this art movie where it's like a guy crashed on a planet, in his battered up X-Wing, and he's just lamenting and thinking about poetry or some crap. It's not like that. It's like, no, this is a Star Wars movie, okay? This is a 50-minute slice of life Star Wars X-Wing pilot dogfight movie. And we're going to do it Star Wars style, but with the abilities that new special effects have as well to show you even more. It's a squadron on a mission, and these guys clearly loved the X-Wing PC simulator. I mean, the dashboards in the instrument clusters in the X-Wings and Y-Wings in this, yes, there are Y-Wings in it. Oops, mild spoiler. It's not really a spoiler. It's not a twist. They're there from the beginning, which, as they should be. But they've got the shield instrument cluster just like they did in the X-Wing game for the Starfighters. They've got a lot of the same controls and stuff in there. It's a hybridization of the actual physical cockpits from the movies along with those added touches we didn't get to see in the Star Wars films because they didn't look in that direction. They were just off camera. Wingman fills all that in. But Wingman does not try to inundate you with technical jargon or anything like that. It doesn't worry about that. It does what Star Wars does. It's not trying to over-educate you on the hardware. It doesn't do anything like that. It treats you and respects your intelligence. It gives you the benefit of the doubt. It treats you like an intelligent person. And it uses the visual language of cinema to fill all those gaps in. Unlike a lot of other Star Wars fan films as well, what I'm about to tell you I think was executed properly has a lot to do with clearly the parts of Star Wars that they loved the most. The fan films that involved all those lightsaber fights that I told you about back in the 2000s and 2010s, they were very prequel focused, obviously. They wanted that fancy lightsaber choreography and Jedi versus a Sith and blah, blah, blah. And the prequels were a very antiseptic trilogy. They got away from the used universe of Star Wars. So a lot of fan films, even ones set in the original trilogy, end up not having that used universe look. Troops did, even though it was a comedy. Very successful satire as well. Wingman understands this. Wingman understands this extremely well. The faces are gritty. The helmets are scratched and beaten up. The ships, they've got that look to them. The Empire has the clean ships and the Rebels have, the gnarly ships. The faces of the performers are made up so that they don't look made up, perfectly. Like they're made up to look like grizzled, strained, aged before their time war veteran types. They found interesting faces to put in the cockpits of these fighters and other vessels. The script of this it reminded me of the kind of scenario that you would run into in an episode of Combat, which is one of my favorite television shows of all time. This is about a squad. This is about one of the squad's challenges that they have now run into, and they've run into many challenges over their career as fighter pilots. And this is their latest challenge. And it's going to come with, despite best laid plans, things are going to go awry because that's war. The guys who made Wingman, they don't just understand special effects. And boy, do they understand special effects. They don't just understand special effects. They don't just understand shot composition. They don't just understand building convincing cockpit interiors, which they totally did, and I was super impressed by that. They understand how to compose a series of fast-paced shots where you don't get lost. They clearly storyboarded the hell out of this to make sure that the audience was completely engaged in what was going on at an edge-of-your-seat, visceral level with the dogfighting. It was extremely well done, and they also understood the writing. They understood, okay, we have to write a scenario that is going to be deserving enough for all of the special effects we're about to have to put in here, because this is a story that takes place in space and not all in one ship. It takes place with a bunch of individuals who are all flying their own ships, including the bad guys. That is not easy. That's not easy for the people that own Star Wars to do. And these guys who did Wingman, they pulled that off. They showed us. I can't say us, I can't speak for you guys. They showed me that every instinct in my body that I had as a Star Wars fan, wanting something like this to be in existence, was the right choice. Some people are going to say, oh, so Michael, it was confirmation bias. Well, maybe in a way. It was validation that this concept not only works, but works really, really well, and it brings Star Wars back. Because Star Wars was not just people running around with lightsabers and Sith Lords that won't die. That all came later. But Star Wars' success was not built on that. They didn't have that. The lightsaber effects back in the day were practically more difficult to do than the starfighters. I mean, there was far more spaceship battle content in the original trilogy than there was lightsaber fighting. They flipped that on its head with the prequels because CGI space battles were probably far more expensive to do than CGI lightsaber effects. So everything got turned around. But with that, you lost the wars part. You lost the connection to the normal guy or girl, gal. You lost the connection to the people who were also fighting those wars. It became Jedis with superpowers and clones who all had the same faces fighting robots. I'm not trying to dog on the prequels in saying that. I'm trying to illustrate for you that when that happened, a fundamental change occurred. And suddenly the faces of the normal people fighting this desperate battle against an evil empire were gone. And yet that was what was the foundational bedrock of that franchise that made it successful, that allowed those prequels to eventually exist. The emotionally resonant part of Star Wars was the conflict between desperate normal people and tyrannical normal people, and what it takes to get into a cramped cockpit and go up into space at 3,000 miles an hour and try and fight this overwhelming onslaught of enemy resources. In fact, enemy resources that are so numerous, they don't even care about putting shields on their ships. TIE fighters have no shields. They'll throw those people into the meat grinder and those ships because they can just keep cranking out the ships and keep forcing people into the army. They'll stop at nothing. And the only thing standing in their way are those pilots. They hold the line. There's no secret there is a Battle of Britain analog there with the RAF, which I did not know as a child until later when I learned about the RAF. And then I was, fascinated by them as a college student. Wingman is the first 50 minutes to an hour of Star Wars that I've seen that really feels like Star Wars since 1983's Return of the Jedi. And look, you might think, well, Michael, that's a massive take. That's ridiculous. That's hyperbolic to the extreme. I feel like Rogue One was compromised. It was close. It was close and it's still watchable, but the seam lines are there where they butchered it up and because they changed their mind. And they shouldn't have. When you look at the marketing and you look at what they were going to do and then they changed their mind, they hobbled the idea. Rogue One would have been the ultimate Star Wars thing since Return of the Jedi, but they choked. The suits, the executives choked. Wingman turns around and says, we understand Star Wars. We understand what the best parts of Star Wars are. We understand that Star Wars doesn't have to hang on a character with a lightsaber or a character whose name you've heard before who's in some mysterious helmet. The excitement of Star Wars came from people in a desperate battle against really, really evil people. And what they were willing to do to put their lives on the line for that dream of freedom and emancipation for the galaxy. And then the really exciting spaceship fights that result and everything that happens with that. These guys are steeped in that lore who made Wingman. They understand all of that. Now, that being said, while I do think that this is the best Star Wars anything that has happened since Return of the Jedi, and I will fight anyone, okay? It is a fan film. It's a very impressive fan film, but it is a fan film, which means that it has some weird production quirks that have nothing to do with the visuals or anything like that. It's stuff that just seems to happen on fan films. I don't know why, it just does. Now, everything I'm about to say, this is not me dunking on Wingman. I absolutely love it. I will watch it another 15 times. Wingman suffers something that a lot of fan films suffer, which is not so much the performances themselves, because most of the writing in Wingman is very good. The writing of the screenplay itself is very good. It's more of a post-production thing where some of the voices appear to be dubbed, like ADR'd. Not that they're out of sync. They're in sync with the lips, but clearly they're not that person talking. They did some ADR work, and in certain cases it looks as if they decided to ADR a different person's voice over another actor, maybe because they wanted a different voice or because availability's changed or something. Who knows? And so I noticed those kinds of things, and so that was a little like, interesting. The other thing I noticed about Wingman, and it's also something that fan films do, is that sometimes fan films overwrite the dialogue. So occasionally in Wingman, there is dialogue that is either sold in a rather odd way because these aren't professional performers, although everything ultimately is like above average. Like, first of all, the post-production, the special effects aren't just above average. They're the best I've ever seen in a fan film. They're incredible. The shot composition, the artistic eye for how they were going to stylize it, everything, nothing was left to chance. There was a clear, effective vision for how they were going to pull off all the Starfighter stuff and how they were going to tell this story visually. A+++. It's where the performances and the written dialogue comes in, where it's a little uneven. Not uneven that it ruins the experience, but just uneven. I think some of the dialogue wasn't like, some of the dialogue it was fine for it to be there, but I kept wondering, like the Steve McQueen approach, where Steve McQueen would just slash out his own dialogue and be like, I can do all this in a look. And there were moments where I was like, yeah, okay, I appreciate the fact that line was there, but I wonder if they could have done that with a look. And that's not because I think the writing itself is bad. It's because if you combine the writing of Wingman's lines in places with some of their ADR choices because of whatever was going on in the background of the production, it's like, oh, well, if I had that ADR challenge, I might have just stricken the line anyway, just because the visuals are doing so much of the heavy lifting and doing it easily because they clearly had real artistic cinematic vision for how they wanted to visually tell the story. I actually think that there are some wonderful moments of dialogue in this film. There are some necessary moments of dialogue in this because obviously some things need to get explained when you're, in these space battles, what they're planning to do. You can't have inner monologue. You can't have them thinking in their heads the whole time. That's not Star Wars. But after I got done with it and I was thinking about it for a while, I was like, I would be really curious to see a wordless Wingman. Like, take this story, take this footage, and edit a version where there aren't any lines. And again, that's not, I'd say, as of the writing of the story, 99% of that writing on the page is great. As of the deliveries of the lines, I would say 85 to 90% of those are great, or great, serviceable to great. But as an artistic exercise, I would be very curious because I think Wingman is so good visually. I think it tells the story so well visually that I think you could do a version that has no dialogue in it at all, and it would still make total sense. I think it would be supremely exciting, almost like the art house version of Wingman. I think that would make just as much sense as the one that has the dialogue in it. Now, obviously, Star Wars has pilot-to-pilot dialogue, and they made the right choice. But as an intellectual exercise, I was just noodling on it. I know I've been talking way too long. So I'm going to wrap it up here. To everyone who worked on Wingman, and I mean everyone, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart that you did it. You guys delivered a dream for a lot of people. A lot of people that they feel the core of Star Wars rests with the starfighter pilots. And Luke Skywalker was a starfighter pilot, so that's not an unrealistic thing to say. He was the best starfighter pilot in the galaxy and a cunning warrior. It was all about pilots. And so, yes, Luke's story went beyond his fighter pilot world and became another crux of that original trilogy. But it all started for him because he was a pilot, and his father was a pilot. Pilots are the crux of Star Wars, as the original trilogy brings it out. And nobody can deny that one of the best moments in Rogue One was when those fighter pilots showed up. I literally jumped out of my seat. And I don't mean just the ones from A New Hope. I mean, in general, when the fanfare plays and the fighters jump out of hyperspace, even before we realized that we were going to see some old faces. The fighter pilots showing up means it's on. Star Wars, unless I'm seeing those, when those fighters show up in a Star Wars movie, it's like Indiana Jones putting his hat on. The movie doesn't get going till Indiana Jones puts his hat on. And X-Wings and Y-Wings and A-Wings and B-Wings showing up with those orange jumpsuits and the helmets and you hear that, that's Star Wars putting its hat on. And it hasn't done that in a really long time. And it's never done it to the extent that you really explore it and you really get into what are these guys' lives like? What is their attitude towards this? And you get that variety with Wingman. You get the different faces where some of them are, they haven't lost their general demeanor and humanity. And some of them are, you can tell, just they're very focused to the point of they're all business. And some of them are, they've lost a little bit of themselves. And some, all of them have been affected in different ways, just like in real combat, just like in a long, protracted campaign, which is what the TV show Combat did so well. Wingman is proof. Wingman is proof that show about X-Wing pilots would have worked. It would have been better than any Mandalorian show. It would have been better than any Book of Boba Fett, any Ahsoka. I'm so grateful to the guys that made Wingman because you've given me the thing I've dreamed about as a proof of concept. You have given me a proof of concept of what I've dreamed about since I was 6, since I was 14. I'm sorry that I'm not trying to be dramatic here. I'm just being genuine, and I hope that a lot of you will at least go try out Wingman, check it out. I've left a link in the description. If you love Star Wars, Wingman is a proof of concept, proof positive that they should have been telling the stories of the X-Wing pilots a long time ago. And it's a shame that they missed that boat. But I'm really, really glad that you guys did it, because maybe that's poetic justice. The fans understand Star Wars better than the company that owns it. And I've said for many years that the fans are doing the best work. The makers of Wingman, they're the fans that did the best work. And if they decide to do a follow-up, I'm standing by.